I'm going to hand this over to Lisa, so she's going to tell you all about storage accounts.
Yeah, storage accounts. It's like a very, I think, interesting part of the AZ-900, but also such an important part that actually when we talk about storage solutions, the only one that I really see mentioned in this part is the storage account. So it's really important that we really get like a thorough understanding of what the storage accounts are. So yeah, let's continue with the next slide. So storage accounts, what they contain, that will be on the next slide, but it's good to know that nowadays we can deploy kind of two different types of storage accounts. So as Azure often does with different kind of services, like we also see this with Azure Data Factory, for example, is that we have like a version 1, which is more the original version, and then we get a version 2. It's almost like going from Python 2 to Python 3, for example. And what we have with this is that in the general purpose version 1, we have like all the old features, and then the new features, they come into version 2. So 99% of the time when we have a new storage account is going to be a version 2. So keep that in mind. But if you are, you know, in the position where you're maybe dealing with a little bit more older storage accounts, then you might find version 1. And basically the version 2 has, as I mentioned, a newer kind of capability. So an example of this, which might make more sense in a little bit of time when I've explained what it is, but a thing that the version 2, for example, has is the blob level tiering, which means that per blob or per file, we can say, hey, I want to put this into cold storage or archive storage because I don't want to access that often. And then for other blobs or other files, we can say, hey, I want to access this very frequently, so make it like hot storage for me. And that was not possible in the general purpose version 1. So if you see these kind of definitions being thrown around, now at least you know the differences between these types of storage accounts. All right. So okay, that's cool and all, but what can we really do with the storage account? Now I know that there's two versions basically, but what is even in there? So on Azure, the storage accounts, as you could view it, is like it's basically a container of different services. So what we often see on Azure with different types of tools, like we also see it in tools like Synapse, what they basically do is they say, well, that is a very great tool. I will just absorb that into my tool and I will make that a capability to you. So we very often see things happening that it's like, you know, we have a platform where we can deploy and utilize multiple things. So then it becomes like, you know, container platforms like Synapse is, but storage accounts are in a way as well. So things that we can have in a storage account, and I will show them in a bit, are blob storage, files, queue storage, and tables. And there is one other one that is a thing I think maybe where sometimes the documentation gets a bit fuzzy and maybe people get a bit confused. But one thing they also mention sometimes is the disk storage. But disk storage, I will show it in a portal as well. That's not something that we find in the storage account, but rather disk storage is usually used like it's highly available storage, but it's usually used for virtual machines. So we don't deploy it in the storage account, but we can deploy it in its own GUIs, in its own graphical user interface, so to speak. But it's not part of a storage account. But it's very handy because they might ask you this, you know, on the exam, like what is disk storage used for? And then you can say, hey, that's for, you know, the virtual machines and such. Well, on the other hand, we have blob storage, and blob storage is very neat because we can basically store any kind of data in there. It's very much like the type of data that you would have on your computer. And as a data engineer, this is the type of storage that I basically use most often. And it's also the thing that I see with customers the most often as well. And it's very handy because you can just store any type of data that you want. So if you want to store a PDF or a CSV or a Parquet, anything is possible. I mean, you could even store like an image or, you know, some music, whatever you like. So that's what blob storage is for. And then when we think about files, Azure Files is more for, you know, putting the files there and then having it available through that network file share. So that's basically what customers would use that for. And you can also create that in a storage account. When we think about Azure Queue Storage, it's about queuing basically. So you put a message on the queue, and that is usually used for messaging between applications or application components. So an application component could basically put a message on the queue saying, hey, you need to do this and this and this. And then another part of that application or an entirely different application can pick up, that messaging and can then execute, the instructions that were in that message, basically. Lastly, what we have is Azure Tables. And Azure Tables is basically like, let's say, a NoSQL kind of quote unquote database. And what it does, I'll show you that in a bit as well, is they have like key value pairs where we store our data. So let's say we have a profile of a person, and then we can say, hey, the name of that person is, let's say, Hank, and the age of Hank is 82. So that's basically the key is the name and the age, and then the value is 82 and the name Hank. And that's basically how that works. So for people that are a little bit more familiar with that kind of storage, it is sometimes a bit like how Cosmos would work. So you would usually use these Azure tables when you have like a little bit less complex use case, then you would go for the tables, because, well, Cosmos is usually quite expensive, and Azure storage accounts in general are really, really cheap. So that's cool. Very cool, I would say. Gregor, is it okay if I share my screen real quick so that I can show the storage account?
Of course, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, give me 1 second. And then I'm hoping to share the right screen, else we will just see my face twice. Which is, I think this is okay now. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
I can't. Can you guys see it?
No, I can still see the slide deck.
Okay, I see my own screen. So
that's a name.
Is it good? Sorry, is it good?
Yeah, all good.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
you're good, Lisa. We can see your screen.
Okay. So, yeah, I have a storage account here. So I just wanted to show we already deployed.
Lisa, I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Well, I just wanted to say we already put so much time and effort into looking into the portal and deploying resources, right? So I didn't want to do that again. So I already pre-deployed a storage account for us, and I just wanted to show it real quick. So what we already see here is the containers, the files, the queues, and the tables, right? So that was that, that little graph I had there. We saw the containers, the files, the queues, and the tables. And what we don't see here is that disk storage that they talked about, right? So if I go here and I go for disks, they have their own parts, and I can create a disk here if I wanted that to do that. But of course, today, we're not going to do that, but I just wanted to point it out and say, okay, they sometimes mention that as part of the storage account, but arguably it's not. So let's start with that blob storage, right? So when we talk about blob storage, we usually store that data inside of the container. So I already pre-created 2 containers for us. And one of the data sets that I really like to use is the squirrel. I cannot even pronounce that. That's why already I think it's so funny. But okay, the squirrel census data. It's in New York, I think, where they start counting all of the squirrels, which I think is hilarious. So I stored some of the data there. So the first thing that I did was I stored the squirrel census data. And then I thought, well, maybe people, they don't know how to use that squirrel census data. So I also decided to put the documentation there on how to use it, which is a Word document. And in blob storage, we can store any type of data, right? So storing a Word document, that's totally fine. But then I also thought, well, maybe people don't know what squirrels look like. So I also stored a picture there. But then I thought maybe people don't know, how to distinguish between different squirrels. And then, so I also put a picture there to help people distinguish between all of these squirrels. So the main takeaway from this is that for blob storage, we create all of these containers and we can store any type of data that we want in there. So let's just take a look, right? If I download this, so I can just go to the desktop. Well, it just starts downloading. And then here I have my image of my squirrels. So we can, distinguish. Maybe we will see a Japanese giant flying squirrel in New York. Well, maybe not. But okay, any type of data we can put in there. So when we talk about file shares, it's actually really easy to just create a file share and then have that available to us through that network that I mentioned, right? So I already created a file share just so that we could go through it real quick. And as you can see here, also I put in that same data set. For messaging, we can use the queues, right? I don't personally like to queue, so I called my queue I don't like to queue. But I mean, we can call it something different if we want to. So here you can see I didn't put any messages on the queue, but here I did. So if you want to talk about data, well, maybe. Do you want to talk about data? Well, you can see here, we can put already some messages here as test. And now it's also on here. Well, of course, normally in a more production kind of environment, we would probably want to do this using code, right? Applications, they don't use that graphical user interface, but it's sure nice to have it available to us to at least, get some idea on how this works. Lastly, as I mentioned, we had that table data, right? So that was key value pairs. Well, I cannot really look at the data, I don't think so, via here, but luckily we have the storage browser. So here I can look at that table. And I created some squirrel profiles, so maybe you want to think a little bit more about all of the profiles that a squirrel has. So here we have partition key, row key, timestamp. It's not that important for us to really know that for the AZ-900, but it's quite, custom normal for database type of applications. But at least it's nice to know that I created these, data points this afternoon. Well, I found 2 squirrels, and one squirrel's name was Ben and the other squirrel name was Fred. But if we wanted to, we could, add an entity as well, add a property here if we wanted to. And then maybe another squirrel's name was Hank. If I insert it to the table, and there we see Hank appears on our screen. So very nice. So I think the main takeaway here for us is that we have storage accounts. Storage accounts is basically a container of all different types of storage. When we talk about blob storage, we store our data in containers and we can store any data that we want. And it's very handy for big data applications, big data analytics as well. I use it very often in my day-to-day work, at least. When we talk more about file shares, it's when we, want to have our files available on the file share. And this is also for larger data sets or larger files, I would say. If we want to have more messaging, then we can use that queues that I just talked about. So we can put a message on the queue and then another part of an application can read that message and execute maybe something that's on the message that says, well, hey, can you do XYZ? And then, another application or another component of that application can pick it up. Then lastly, we had these tables where we had key value pairs, right? So if I wanted to make a profile of my squirrel and name all of the squirrels, we could definitely do that in key value pairs and, get some data in there to show what kind of squirrels that we had seen and what names they had. All right, so I think we can go back to the slides now, Gregor.
Okay, bear with me. See how this works.
I will just stop the sharing. That might make it a bit easier.
How's that? Can you see it now?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Let me just move on a slide. There we go.
Yes. So, as I already briefly mentioned, right, there are different types of tiers in storage. So what the people of Azure thought about, they were like, okay, well, sometimes we have data that we access frequently. And sometimes we have data that we access less frequently. And, that's quite common, so to say. So there are basically 3 different storage tiers, and they all have their own pros and cons. So what they might ask you on the exam, or at least, it's in the exam content, the tiers that we have is hot, cool, and archive storage. So when we talk about hot storage, that is the type of storage that's actually most common, most often used, and it has the highest performance. And what they mean with highest performance is that when we read the data, we get it back the most quickly. So we can read it the fastest, basically. It's for data that we access frequently. But what does frequently really mean? We could do like a cost analysis of that if we wanted to. I can show you that maybe a little bit later on, because I think we have sufficient amount of time. So, yeah, sorry, I got distracted there for 1 second. Excuse me. But the thing with hot storage is basically that it has the highest storage costs. So what we see here is that in hot storage, accessing the data, that costs the least compared to all these different, storage options. But storing the data costs the most. And that's what makes this, type of storage interesting, because, storing it costs a lot of money, relatively speaking to the other tiers, but getting that data out, that costs the least. And when we think about cool storage, then, that is for data that is accessed less frequently, because, well, storing the data costs less than the hot storage, but accessing the data, that costs more. So that's also why it's for less frequently accessed data. Then when we talk about data that we access almost never, but we need to have it for archiving purposes. So maybe we have some log data that we need to, for regulatory requirements, we have to have, but we don't really need to have it for our day-to-day business, if that makes sense. Then we can go for more archive storage kind of things. So this is data that we want to keep around for long periods of time, but we don't really access that. So that is the lowest cost to store when it comes to this type of data, but it costs the most to access the type of data, if that makes sense. So Gregor, what do you think? Shall we go to the cost calculator for 1 second, and then I'll show the storage accounts?
Yep, go for it. I'll stop soon.
Okay, give me 1 second. So just to drive that point home, because I think I do have the time for it. And the pricing calculator. Yes. Oh, it's going to Korea Central. Okay. Very interesting. Maybe we do something UK. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, all good.
Good. Okay, so basically here, what's important is that I'm going to change the access tier, right? So hot, cool, and archive. So when we talk about hot here, you can see that the storage average per month for that 1,000 gigabytes for the hot is about $19. Oop. Then I go to the cool, and then you can see that going down to 10. Then when I go for the archive, you can see that going down to $250. So that basically means that with the hot storage, it costs the most to have. Oh, maybe not help me right now. Thank you. For the hot storage, it costs the most to, store the data per month. But accessing the data, so for example, writing data here, that costs about 59 cents per 10,000 operations. And then if we go to cool, you can see that going up to $1.10. And then when we go to archive, we can go see that go up to $1.25. So that's basically the point. Hot storage is for accessing frequently because that costs the least, but storing that data costs the most. And then when we talk about archive storage, then, storing the data costs less, but accessing the data costs more. So that's basically the point. And then I would make the point and say, hey, it's important to know for the exam, but in reality, usually what we see is customers just use the hot storage tier because, well, storage actually doesn't cost that much on Azure when it comes to storage accounts. So usually it's not really I mean, you could make like a cost analysis and really calculate what is most cost effective for your business. But the chances of it really being a high savings is only there when you have really, really, really large amounts of data. So if you don't have a use case where you have like really, really large amounts of data, then don't bother, I would say. Just go with the hot, access tier. But the more you get like more and more data, then do dive into it, and of course learn it for the exam. But in practice, it's a bit debatable. I don't really see a lot of companies using cool and archive storage. I don't know about you, Gregor. Do you often see like archive storage?
No, to be fair, no. I think it's pretty rare.
Yeah.
Obviously, hot is very common.
Yeah.
I've never really seen anyone use cool or archive, but obviously people do need it and do use it. But yeah, it's not that common. I don't think. Not across our customers, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, I have the same. I would say if you have to keep your like large amounts of data around for regulatory requirements, then for sure go with the archive or with the cool storage. But unless you have really large amounts of data, it doesn't really matter that much. Storage accounts are not super expensive. All right, can we go back to the slides? Yes. So as I mentioned, there were 3 storage tiers, right? We had hot, cool, and archive storage. Cool and archive storage aren't really being used that often, but they might ask you this on the exam. So going from hot to archive, that is for data that's accessed less and less frequently. But, the storage gets cheaper when we go to archive storage, but getting that access to that data, accessing, writing files, that's more expensive for archive compared to hot storage. All right.
One thing I would say as well, just quickly, is when you put something into archive, trying to get it back out takes quite a long time, which people don't really realize until they need it back, and it takes. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it's quite a long time, like days. It's not even. I don't even think it's hours. I think it might even be days.
Yeah.
That's kind of why it's so cheap. So.
That is a very valid point too, I would say. Yes, it does take, like, the latency is a lot higher in archive and cool storage. So it's also, it does come at a cost in that regard for waiting costs. Yeah, fair point. All right. So now we kind of have an idea of what we can do with our storage account. We know what kind of different storage accounts there were, right? Version 1. Version 2, we knew that we had like blobs, we had queues, we had tables, whatnot. But okay, what about our data center, right? So in the first course that we had, we talked a little bit about data centers. Because of course, our Azure infrastructure under the hood, that is going to be real infrastructure. That's going to be, real computers in a data center, racks and racks of servers. So one thing that we need to think about when deploying a storage account is how our data is stored. Basically, storage redundancy. So storage redundancy is about, okay, I don't want to store, my file once in a data center, right? Because, well, it's like with my computer. If I store a file on my computer and my computer breaks, the file is gone. And we don't really want that to happen to our company data, do we? So we have to think about that storage redundancy. So what Azure basically says is, okay, always when we have our storage account, we ensure that your data set, your file, is replicated 3 times within that data center in the region that we've chosen. But I mean, think about that for a second. Do we really want that too? I mean, it's nice that we have that data set replicated 3 times in that data center, because that ensures that when one of these server racks breaks, well, we don't immediately lose all of our data, which has quite a high chance of happening, I would say, at least over time. But, at least we are protected against that when we decide to store our data 3 times throughout that data center, because if one rack breaks, we still have that file stored in 2 different locations. It may be a different server rack, but I love this slide too, yes. But, is that really sufficient? Is that really sufficient for us? For some use cases, maybe yes, but what would happen if we literally, what if a Simpson character came in there and was like, hey, I'm going to set fire to that data center? Would we be really protected against big disasters? And the answer is unfortunately no. But luckily for us, Azure did think about that. So that's very cool. So we have something called primary region and secondary region redundancy. So we have the chance to choose about 4 different types of redundancy. So we have locally redundant storage, zone redundant storage, and then in the next slide, I will show you the geo-redundant storage and geo-zone redundant storage. So let's go over that real quick. When we talk about locally redundant storage, that's what I just talked about. So we have our data set stored 3 times within that one single data center. It has the lowest costs because, well, I mean, we don't have it replicated that often throughout all of these data centers. And it gives us like a very high availability with about 3 nines after that dot. So that's quite a high availability. But still, if that data center goes down, all of our data is gone, basically. When we think about zone redundant storage, that is only available, of course, for regions that have multiple data centers, because of the fact that what they do is they store your data set still 3 times, or your file or your PDF, whatnot. They still store it 3 times, but they divide that over other data centers throughout that region. So you get a little bit higher availability, about 10 nines after that dot in the SLA. But if the whole zone goes down, you still lose your data. So if we have a disaster and that Simpsons character, goes through all of the data centers in that zone, then you still lose all of your data. So if we go one slide next. That is where that secondary region redundancy comes in. So they thought, okay, well, we have that, locally redundant storage and that zone redundant storage, but we want to go one step further. We want to go outside of our region. So with that, we get the geo-redundant storage and the geo-zone redundant storage. So when we use that geo-redundant storage, we are more protected against disasters happening in the region, because now we store our data not only in that primary region, but in another region as well. So that's very cool, because now we are ensured that if something goes down in that one region, we can fall back on the other region. And the 2 options that we have there is that geo-redundant storage and the geo-zone redundant storage. So what we do in the geo-redundant storage is we store it basically in total 6 times. So we store it 3 times in that one data center in region 1, and then we store it 3 times in another data center in that secondary region. So it's stored in 2 data centers, but both are in different regions. Well, with that geo-zone redundant region, geo-zone redundant storage, we go a step further, because that's basically like having zone redundant storage, where we have data in one region and we store it 3 times over different data centers, but we do this for 2 different regions. So in region 1, it's stored 3 times over different data centers in that region, and then in the other region, it's stored again 3 times over different data centers in that region. And that gives us the lowest chance that if anything ever goes wrong, that we lose our data, because now it's stored over all kinds of different data centers in these regions. So then we have like really, really robust type of storage, I would say. But, even though we have like really high availability, 16 nines behind the dots, yeah, it does cost a little bit more. So that's also why we see a lot of companies are not willing to pay for it, even though this is the most secure type of storage, right? If anything happens in one region, then we're still secure because we have our data sets, our PDFs, our files in another region as well. All right, Gregor, can we go on slide further, please? So that was really cool. What did we learn? We learned a little bit about storage account, different types that we had. We learned a little bit about, what's kind of the different types of storage things that we have in a storage account, right? That bulk storage, the files, the queues, and the tables. We learned a little bit about, the storage tiers that we can choose between these tiers: hot storage, cool storage, archive storage, and then about storage redundancy. But what are the benefits of that storage account, right? So if we're still not convinced, then, in the AZ-900, they also want to tell us what the benefits are. If we choose the right redundancy for us, we have, of course, that high availability, right? So the more redundancy that we have, the higher the availability that we're ensured in the SLA. Well, generally speaking, storage accounts are quite secure, even though with most of these things, if you don't set them up right, you can make them quite not so secure. But, Microsoft helps you with the encryption of your data and whatnot, and helps you with fine-grained access control. You have all of these different ways to give people access to not only files, but also your container. So there's quite a lot out there for you that is out of the scope for this course, but is still pretty interesting for you to read on if you're interested. Storage accounts are always highly scalable, so we can store small amounts of data in there, but if we want more, then we can just put more data in there and we'll just pay for it. And that's just how it works. So it's not like with a database where we have to scale up, or with a disk where we have to scale up. We just put more data in there, we get the bill at the end of the month, and we're good. It's managed by Microsoft, which is, of course, for us Azure people a plus as well. And it's very accessible, as I mentioned. You have a lot of different ways to access the data. So I think that's pretty cool too. All right, Gregor, can we go one slide? Thank you. Yes. I don't. Yeah. Okay. So data, between brackets, migration options for migrating to Azure. You might be thinking to yourself, Lisa, this is nice and all, but okay, good. I don't even know how to migrate to Azure. I might have a database on-premise somewhere, and how do I even get that to Azure? But maybe you're in another cloud, maybe you're in Amazon or you're in Google, and you're like, okay, Lisa, that's, nice, but how do I even get to Azure? So there's two tools that I want to talk to you about today. And that's basically Azure Migrate and Azure Data Box. And Azure Data Box is actually part of Azure Migrate, but it's so cool that I just wanted to mention it separately as well. All right, can we go one slide further? So basically, when you're on the Azure platform and you want to migrate to Azure, but you have no clue where to start, then Azure Migrate might be the tool for you. Azure Migrate is what they call a unified migration platform. So we have different tools. So we have discovery and assessment, where we can discover the steps that we need to take in order to migrate, and they assess, whether this is like compatible or not. And then they have the migration tools for you ready, where, you can start the migration basically. So there's a lot of purposes that we can use Azure Migrate with. So that's why I put that data in brackets, right? So it's not only for data. We can also help migrating things like web apps or VDIs, but also, the servers and the databases as well. So for example, if you want to migrate to Azure File Shares, then this is a tool that we could use. And I think, Gregor, I just want to share the screen so I can show the tool real quick, because I think sometimes it just helps a bit if you just see the tool. What do you think?
Sure. Yep, go for it.
Okay. I think I need to do this one. Yeah. So basically what we can already see here, so there is some documentation for us ready to get started, some things that we can learn about if we want to migrate our workload to Azure. And here you can already see some of the migration goals, right? So migrating servers, databases, and web apps, databases, VDI, web apps. And here we also have that data box that we're going to speak about in a bit. So this is basically just what I wanted to show you. Let's say I wanted to migrate a database. Then if I click here, I already created a project beforehand because I didn't want to take too much of you guys' time. But if I wanted to create a database and I have already created a project, then for example, I can start an assessment here, and then I can also get some help with my migration. So if you don't know where to start with your Azure migration, then I would say Azure Migrate might be a good tool for you to check out. Gregor, Simon, Matt, did you guys ever use Azure Migrate?
I haven't. No, personally, no, not used it. I know a lot of people at Intercept have used it.
I used it. I've used it for a customer project where we lifted and shifted them from a dying on-premise server. It was a VMware environment. And we migrated all their VMs to Azure.
Very cool. Very cool. Did you like using the tool?
Yeah, it was really good. So it basically does like an analysis of your current environment and then pairs what it thinks would be the recommended SKU for the virtual machines.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can pick and choose if you want to scale them up or scale them down. And then it gives you the option for, if you want, you can like sandbox it in the staging environment first.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do your testing and various bits and pieces. And once you're happy, you can then cut over to production. So it was really, really cool and worked really well for the customer migration I did.
Oh, cool. Cool. I like it. Well, it's good to mention that, of course, you're not limited to Azure Migrate. So if you want to make your own plan and do your own work, then you totally can. But if you don't know where to start or just want a little bit, more handy environment, then for sure check out if Azure Migrate is the tool for you. Okay, Gregor, can we move to the slides? And then one further. Yeah, so Azure Data Box, right? I thought it was so cool that I just wanted to speak a little bit more about it. So basically, if you're ever in a situation where you have loads of data, but you don't really have access to the internet or limited network connectivity, what they say, then you can order something called the Azure Data Box. So what they would do is they would actually send you like a physical disk where you can store your data on and then send it to Azure, and then they will put it on Azure for you. So I think I haven't used that before, but I can certainly think of some use cases where that could be incredibly handy. So I thought that's really cool. So per data box, I would say the maximum amount of data that we can send to Azure is 80 terabytes, which I think is quite a lot of data. And we can just order that using the Azure portal, right? So as I mentioned, this is part of Azure Migrate. So we can order this when we go to the migration or Azure Migrate page, so to speak. So when would we use it? As I mentioned, we would use it when we have limited network connectivity or maybe not even access to a network. And then usually what we would use this for is for either a one-time, periodic, or initial load. And an initial load is basically when we are in a situation that we have our data, let's say in a data center that doesn't have network connectivity, and we put all of that data in Azure. And then going forward from there, we're using Azure instead of that data center. So that's basically what an initial load is. So we just put all of the data in Azure, and then we say, okay, well, we're using Azure from that point onwards. An example of this could be that we have a library, and in that library, we have a lot of videos or we have a lot of photos, but all of that data that is stored locally there in the library. But we want to give access to that data to everybody that can use the internet so that people can look at these videos, these old videos that might have like really significant value to of like cultural value, for example, and we want to enable people to access that from home. Well, it's not possible doing that in the library itself because it might have limited network connectivity, but we do want to put that on Azure, so we can just order that data box and that will come to us. Then we put all of the data on it, send it back to Azure, and then they will upload it to Azure for us, which I think is really cool. Okay, if we can go one slide further. So this is basically what the graphical user interface would look like if we search the data box. So we can say, okay, I want it for this subscription, this resource group, and I want it to be moved to, this Azure region, etc., etc. All right, if we go on further, then I just really wanted to show quickly what that data box looks like. I think it's very, very cool. So it's really a physical device that you get and then send back to Azure.
Yep.
All right.
I've never actually seen one of these before.
No, I hadn't seen it before either because I had never ordered it.
This vision that was going to be like the biggest boxes I've ever seen. Yeah, it doesn't look that big actually, which is
no, not as big as you would think it would be for that much data, right?
Yeah.
I think it's very funny. So if you ever think I want to move to Azure but limited network connectivity, let us know how that goes, and I would love to hear some stories about it. All right. So, now we are in the Azure platform and we think, okay, that's cool and all. I have some files in the cloud and I would like to move it or manage it or whatnot. So if you go one slide further, there is basically 3 types of tools that they talk about in the AZ-900 that we can use for exactly that purpose. So the first one is AzCopy. Then we have Azure Storage Explorer. And then lastly, Gregor will help me talk about Azure File Sync because I've never used that one myself. So we can go one slide further. Yes. So AzCopy is basically, you could see it a bit like a package, you could say, in your command line interface. So what we use AzCopy for is for copying and maybe managing a bit to that cloud to cloud, moving files from cloud to cloud, I should say. So if you want to move a file to our storage account from, locally, or maybe from Amazon or from Azure to Azure, then we can use that AzCopy. It is pre-installed in the Azure command line interface for people that use that. It's in the portal. We can just access it there if we wanted it to, because it's pre-installed. But if you're not familiar with that, it's good to know it's also available for your computer as well. If you follow the link that I put there, then you can have some tutorial to how to use it, because it can be quite handy. And in the bottom, I also put like a small example of how that would look like, so that you can see that this is really just a command that we put, in the Azure CLI, or, locally in our bash or whatnot, whatever you use. And you just see that, okay, there's a command called AzCopy, and then we say, okay, copy this and this file to that and that storage account container, and then it will basically execute it. So it's just a syntax that helps us to move files around or to create containers and stuff like that. All right, so if we go one slide further, yes. So if we're not really wanting to program anything ourselves, as much as you can call it programming, but if we don't want to write anything that looks like code, we can go with the Azure Storage Explorer. So the Azure Storage Explorer really looks like what we would see in our own computer. So if we go to our computer and we look at all of our files, that's basically what the Azure Storage Explorer looks like as well. It helps us with managing the files and blobs in our Azure Storage account. So this is really the same as with AzCopy. It's really geared towards storage accounts. So that's important to know. If you want to use Azure Storage Explorer, we can download it on Windows. We can download it on Mac and Linux as well. So that's really good. And it's that graphical user interface that is very handy for users that don't want to code, but also, for the people that can code, but just like to drag and drop a bit and click around. Also, it uses that AzCopy in the background, if I'm not mistaken. So Gregor, if we can go one slide further. This is the graphical user interface that you would see. I mean, At least if you use dark mode like me, I mean, that's the way to go, right? So what we can see here is that for my subscription, I have a storage account. It was called Lizard08. And I had maybe blob files, queues, tables, right? That were the things that we have in our storage account. And I expanded one of these things that was the blob containers. And what you see there is that I had a container. It was called This is a Container. And I opened it. And there you see in the middle screen that I had a file stored in that storage account container. And it was a picture of a flamingo. So what I could do here is I could maybe upload a new picture if I wanted it to, or maybe a new file. I could maybe create a container. I could create a new folder, but I could also download that flamingo picture to my own local storage if I wanted it to. So this is really for managing these files in that storage account. All right, Gregor, I think if we go one slide further, we have the file sync.
Yeah, I'm disappointed you didn't have a picture of a squirrel in your file.
It's because I created these slides before I created the squirrels.
Okay, Azure File Sync. So I haven't really used this much other than when I was preparing for this exam. So Azure, let me just move the screen a little. Azure File Sync, it's basically a Microsoft service that you can use and organizations can use. So let's say there's an organization that you work for and you have offices in like New York and London and Sydney, for example, and you have file shares. You can use Azure File Shares to sync these file shares between organizations. And that's really the gist of it. You can also use it for backups. I actually used ChatGPT really quickly just to bring up some examples of what we'd use it for. So it's just saying you can use it for disaster recovery. So if you have a file share locally, you can copy it up to Azure and use that as a backup. You can use it as a cloud backup. So if you're using maybe other clouds, you can use Azure File Sync to use that for syncing files. And you can use it for things like data center migration. So if you're moving files from one data center, like on-premise data set, on-prem data to the data center, you can use it for that. So there's a couple of examples of Azure File Sync. What I would recommend doing is if you're not really sure what this does and some of these other tools that Lisa's covered, crack open the Azure portal and just play about with them. That's kind of how you get used to doing it. I think I used a file sync just to sync some files to Azure and back just to see what was happening. I always used to think it was like OneDrive, and in my head it was a bit like OneDrive, but OneDrive is slightly different. So my understanding of Azure File Sync wasn't what I thought it was. So my advice would be crack open the portal, go to Azure File Sync and sync some files to Azure, and you can see what it's about. And that's really it. I don't know if I haven't really seen the chat if there's any questions. Yeah, it's like DFSR for the cloud. Yeah,